This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to this special episode of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast focused on adjusting the thiol dial. Brought to you interruption-free by the innovative and industry-leading team at Berkeley Yeast. Berkeley has been on the forefront of fermentation-related science since their inception, and whether it's fresh strains that keep diacetyl ultra-low, NA strains that make non-alcoholic beer that actually tastes like beer, flavor series strains that target specific profiles, or tropics strains that deliver a burst of thiols, they've got the yeast that'll help you make better beer. In this episode, we're going to go deep on the science of thiols, new research that busts myths about thiol expression in hoppy beers, useful ways that leading brewers are artfully integrating thiols into the overall profiles of their beers, clever ways to manipulate thiol expression and intensity, and a whole lot more. Joining me for this conversation are Nick Walker of Ology Brewing from Tallahassee in my home state of Florida. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thanks, Jamie. Glad to be here.
You know, I came very, very close to going to FSU for college back into the 90s. I'm familiar with Tallahassee. My mom was a Knoll. My dad was a Gator. It was one of those difficult households to grow up in when Thanksgiving weekend came around. But anyway, excited to have you on the podcast. Also joining us is Gene Wagoner, head brewer for ISM Brewing in Long Beach, California. Welcome to the podcast, Gene.
Thank you very much.
For those readers of Craft Beer and Brewing, you may remember that ISM's Chepadelic was one of our beers of the year in 2025, and then went on to win gold at GABF in the New Zealand IPA category, which tells me you guys know a thing or two about thiols. Gene, really excited to get into your head and understand what you know. Also joining us, Tim Shasha, brand ambassador for Berkeley Yeast, co-founder, former head brewer of Cellar Maker in the Bay Area. Welcome back to the podcast, Tim.
It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
You're wearing a couple of hats here, both for Berkeley Yeast, but also as a brewer, and we're going to kind of and you also still are writing lots and lots of interesting recipes across all sorts of beer styles that many people can go see on beerandbrewing.com, and they definitely should. We're going to tap into both of those sides of your brain. And also joining us is Nick Harris, co-founder of Berkeley Yeast. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Jamie. Good to see you.
We're going to keep our Nicks straight on this one. We've got two of them here. Let's start off with a broad overview of what thiols are and how they contribute to beer flavor. You know, if I look back at we've been writing about thiols for the better part of 10 years now, from the early days, and that science has come so far in that time, from those very early Stan Hieronymus articles about thiols, measuring them and understanding what they are, to now having these incredible products that unleash thiols and allow for adjusting thiol expression. But maybe, Nick Harris, you can give us a little bit of a background of what we're talking about when we talk about thiols, what some of that science is, what kind of flavors they contribute to beer, how they work to produce that flavor, and then just give us the broad the science background and overview.
Absolutely. If you look at the chemical composition of pretty much any fruit, especially tropical fruits like guava, passion fruit, grapefruit, the one thing that you'll see in common is that all of these fruits have a high abundance of thiols. Thiols are sulfur-containing molecules that are detectable at extremely low concentrations. So actually, your nose is much better at picking out thiols than even a very fancy piece of equipment like a mass spectrometer. We can detect them at nanogram per liter concentrations, that's parts per trillion. But when they're in the microgram per liter concentrations in a beer, then they really can bring about big notes of tropical fruit. So for brewers that are trying to push the boundaries of tropical flavor expression in IPAs, for instance, targeting thiols is a great way of doing that. Now, there are some thiols that don't taste great or might detract from an otherwise good tasting IPA. Sometimes you might want certain thiols in low concentrations, and other times you might want them in high concentrations. But for example, there's a thiol called 3-MBT. This is what gives cannabis its characteristic dank note or skunk smell. There are thiols like 4-MMP, which can smell like box tree, or kind of bring about a more diesel-like character, which is great in some IPAs, for instance, but I certainly don't like it in all IPAs. There's a time and a place for it. And then the thiol that I think is perhaps the most liked is 3-MH, and there's also an ester form of that called 3-MHA. And that thiol, as well as its corresponding acetate ester form, really does smell like pure grapefruit, guava, passion fruit. Sometimes what we hear is that thiols are polarizing. And what I really think is going on there is that it's not 3-MH or 3-MHA that's polarizing. I think it's the other thiols in particular that are polarizing, or it might be the different processes used, sometimes like mash hopping, for instance, that might bring about other and undesirable flavors. So for instance, if you're mash hopping with saws, and I'm sure we'll get deeper into all the details here, but just as a quick explanation, if you're mash hopping with a hop that hasn't historically been used in an IPA, it's not like the mash tun is a magical place for extracting thiols or thiol precursors. There are other compounds that are extracted during that process. So you might end up with a beer that tastes more spicy or vegetal. And so I think when people say that thiols are polarizing, number one, they're talking very broadly about a whole range of different sensory attributes. And then there might also be other compounds that aren't even thiols that are kind of getting mixed up in that opinion.
From what I understand around some of the science on this too, it's like thiols and different thiols can work in different ways around this. It's not simply a function of, hey, if I want more of this, then I just get, I pump up more of that thiol. That some of these, when it comes to perception, kind of have a peak, and then, as you load even more in, they start to transform in a sensory, perspective.
I would say for the most part, that's true for some thiols. Like for instance, Formin P. Low concentrations, I get current. It smells pretty nice, but when it starts being pushed into the high microgram per liter range, to me, then it sort of shifts and it can taste more plastic-like or more diesel-like. Burnt rubber even is another descriptor. Slightly different than SO2, which can have more of like a burnt match-like aroma. So Formin P for sure, the flavor profile of it changes dramatically as you step up concentration. But 3-MH, on the other hand, I find that thiol, low levels and high levels, is actually quite nice. And we'll get into it in a little bit, I'm sure, but we have a product called Tropics Boost, which is just the precursor for 3-MH dissolved in ethanol and water. That's it. So when you add that into a beer in combination with our Tropics yeast, you're just boosting up or dialing up 3-MH concentrations, but you're not dialing up any of the other more polarizing thiols. And so that will just give you a nice clean expression of grapefruit and passion fruit. And turning that up on a dimmer switch doesn't really change the sensory perception, but it will allow you to have those flavors be more prominent in different recipes. So if you're dry hopping and you're finding that thiols are being washed out, you can just turn it up by adding more Tropics Boost and get those flavors to punch through those hops. But again, I don't find that hitting high levels of 3-MH is all that polarizing or changes the sensory all that much. But for other thiols, for sure.
We often associate thiols with New Zealand hops, and in the wine world, we associate thiols in wine with Sauvignon, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Those things are, feel connected in some kind of way. But thiols exist. They exist in Pacific Northwest hops. They exist, or at least the potential to unlock thiols exist even in barley. For that matter. You talked to me about where these precursors come from that yeast can act on in order to pull out some of that thiol expression.
Barley has a ton of thiol precursor, as do hops. But barley has a lot of the precursors for 3-MH. Those can exist in two different states. One is the glutathioneolated 3-MH, and the other one is cysteinolated 3-MH. An important thing to note about precursors is that they don't have any sensory attributes. They don't smell like anything. So you can have a beer that's loaded up with precursors, and you won't taste those thiols at all. They have to be unlocked or unbound by specific enzymes that most yeast don't express. So in the case of tropics, it's expressing or producing an enzyme that specifically releases the thiol from those precursor molecules. The way that we did that was by inserting a new gene from elsewhere in the microbial world. In this case, Tropics is expressing an enzyme from Citrobacter, which is a commensal organism, and it's producing just that one enzyme. That one enzyme is called a carbon-sulfur lyase, and lyase means to break a bond. In this case, it's breaking a carbon-sulfur bond. And so it's unlocking these volatile thiols from these precursor molecules. So the primary way of getting thiols into your beer is by loading up the wort with precursors from barley, and you're just doing this anyways. Whenever you're brewing a beer with any base malt, you're loading it up with thiol precursors. Hops also have thiol precursors. Those precursors are extracted on the hot side. Doesn't matter if you add them in the mash, the boil, or the whirlpool, you're going to extract those precursors. And then a lot of hops also have free thiols. So you mentioned Nelson, for instance. Nelson has a lot of free thiols. Not just 3-MH, it also has a ton of Formin P, and that's why Nelson can give off great notes of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, for instance, or grapefruit, but it can also carry with it a lot of those more diesel-like notes. So a lot of the differences that you experience in hops that have free thiols is the composition of thiols, the different types of thiols that they have.
So we've got bound thiols that can be unlocked. We have free thiols that exist that will just express no matter how they're added. And and so let's maybe kind of pivot and start talking about the way that you all as brewers are using some of these tools in the very early days of thiol focus. And as brewers got more and more interested in the mid 20 teens in New Zealand, I shouldn't say even mid, like early 20 teens. Interested in New Zealand hops and those kinds of flavors that are thiol driven. The initial impulse is like everything that American brewers face, which is how do we do this at the loudest possible volume and do it the most. And we try to we like American brewers in particular are very good at finding limits, and then we eventually figure out a way to come back to it. We did that with sour beer and made sour beer as sour as anyone could possibly make it, and then realized like, hey, wait, that's not really drinkable. Let's figure out how to make this more interesting, nuanced, and something people can enjoy. And I think that initial burst into thiols was very focused on how do we get the most out of this. And now over the last say 5-ish years in that post-pandemic era, we've focused on how do we find a way to tuck this gracefully into a flavor profile. So Gene, for you guys at ISM, how has that kind of progression through, focus on thiols moved for you all? You all brew a wide range of IPAs, lots and lots of West Coast IPAs, New Zealand IPAs, also medal, GABF and Craft Beer and Brewing Beer of the Year winning New Zealand IPA that definitely focuses on thiol, but does it in a controlled and artful way. Over the last few years, talk about that kind of, thinking about it from a flavor perspective and how that has shifted for you all.
Sure, yeah. So I think, first off, I'll say that we haven't had a heck of a lot of experience with London Tropics, despite using Fresh Chico all the time for, West Coast IPAs and some other beer styles. But I would say that we have experimented a little bit with mash hopping to try and minimize IBU pickup from, even like first word hop or, the earlier kettle editions, and just kind of throw another layer earlier on with both flowers or pellets. But I think kind of going back to what Nick was saying about malt, I think that's a place where we played around a little bit more, being that we brew so much West Coast IPA as opposed to hazy IPA. You know, we're maybe 8 to 12 batches of hazies throughout the year, where we're really driving hard on the West Coast. But even I want to say it is something that we played around with, where blending even 50-50 two-row and Gambrinus pills, or another very light super neutral Pilsner malt does seem to make a little bit of a difference, even when we're not talking about using thiolized yeasts. And so that's been kind of fun to play around with. Even small amounts of Vienna in kind of the more American leaning IPAs has been something that's definitely had even some impact, when you're quality control checking the beer, all the time. So
Sure. We'll come back and talk about some of the mash hopping stuff and some of the evolving science around that in a minute. But Nick Walker, how have you all thought about the flavors that thiols give within your IPAs, hazy West Coast, whatever, and how have you then thought about that in a creative sense, working that into the beers you make, and how has that developed over the last half a decade?
So for us, we have a pretty basic approach to our IPAs in that we try not to be too drastic in every step that we do. We read about things that are happening every week at different magazines and podcasts, and I think it would throw our clientele off a little bit by trying every one of those. So what we like to do is try things a little bit at a time. That's kind of how we started First and Thiol as well, and now we're using essentially every one of our IPAs is thiolized yeast. And so for us, it was, well, this is something's cool, something to play around with, it's something new and interesting, but it doesn't sound like it's going to just totally throw our IPAs in left field. We didn't reduce the amount of hops we were using. We didn't try a lot of the techniques that were kind of being lauded around with it, but instead let's play around with our base IPA recipe, but starting around with the yeast, because it sounds like they add a lot of flavor and baseline profile that we find appealing. So let's move from there. And that's kind of where we started. And as all these things do, it evolves and it starts becoming part of your process or not a part of your process, but it's kind of a big part of ours. And for us, like I said, we throw the same amount of hops at it. We experiment with different hops to try to see how's that going to change the profile. I love this hop. Is it going to work in this? And generally it does. And we've had a lot of good success with it.
Do you think about it in terms of specific flavors and what some of those like elements of flavor add at certain levels to some of these IPAs? I mean, how do you think about it as you are writing a recipe?
Honestly, it's just experimentation. For me, I feel like I keep reading a new thing every couple months on the thiolization and what's going on and what I can anticipate in the recipe development side. So instead, like I said, we're a little bit more methodical, a little bit more not even methodical in the way of like, we try to think through every step, but just approach things a little slower and figure out, that didn't turn out as well as we liked. Let's try another step. So let's revert back 2 steps and take another fork on the road. And that approach worked really well for us in our business.
Sure. Tim, how about you? I remember, Ben, the Cellar Maker days, a beer that you sent out my way called Wild Gooseberry Chase, which had something like 5 different selections of Nelson in it, and a phenomenal beer. And I believe it scored a 97 with the blind judges of Craft Beer and Brewing. Just an awesome beer. But obviously you've been engaged not just in getting thiols, but in massaging very specific expressions of thiols that capture certain kinds of flavor and intensities, and doing it in that a very, very finely adjusted kind of way. How has your thinking about the way that thiols appear in West Coast IPA and in hazy IPA evolved over the last 10 years of really focused work in this space?
We had at Cellar Maker 50% of our IPA, hazy IPA that is, was fermented with a haze positive Chico strain that was, out of the way, let the hops speak for themselves. And so those would always be like a true to type expression of the hops. The other 50%, I think since 2021, we would use Tropics London to give a more thiol forward presentation. And so that was like just a great internal experiment to see how we as the brewers reacted, but also the customers reacted to like how we were constructing these beers. And so the Chico beers, it's a Chico fermented beer, so it's a little more svelte. It gives you the true to type hop expression, like I said. And then the London Tropics, that's a London Ale parent strain. And so that's more haze positive, a little more pillowy mouthfeel. And then you get the burst of 3MH and 3MHA, the thiols. And so when presenting those to customers, it was really interesting because I'm, for all the recognition we got for making hazy IPA, it's not something I drink all the time, but it was something we were proud of. But at the same time, you're looking to pay the bills, right? And so, if I'm looking at the data of our sales numbers and the untapped scores, which I people might not admit that they look at, but I think we all do, you could tell that the London Tropics beers with that thiol presentation always was preferred by the customer over the other beers. Now, the Wild Gooseberry Chase that you mentioned had a ton of Nelson in it, and that goes a long way and just has a lot of character, has a lot of tropical fruit, has that diesel character. It's a little bit polarizing sometimes, but that was a very popular beer too. But if I had fermented that beer with the Tropics London and had that just like little touch of thiol in there, a little extra thiol, I imagine it would be even more popular. One of the criticisms that I think these thiol producing yeasts get is that if you are fermenting, numerous generations with it, that they kind of all smell the same. And I totally know what people mean by that, but brewers mean by that, but I totally disagree. There's just like such a potent aroma of 3MH in there, and it just exudes juiciness. And so I really just found ways to kind of like balance that via hop selection and create something that was more enticing because of 3MH, but also like didn't rely upon it too much. And what I find funny is, London Ale 3 or any of the derivatives of that yeast, also like when you drink a hazy IPA, it's such a ubiquitous yeast. Like I can taste that flavor in almost every hazy IPA. I don't particularly like that pure London 3 expression. I get why people use it. It is a juicy character. It's haze positive. You get the mouthfeel. But London Tropics parallels that, but just with a different aroma. It has the haze and the mouthfeel of London Ale, but it's more passion fruit, right? And for me, London Ale is kind of more, we would describe it internally as like a orange cake frosting aroma, like almost kind of like a rich vanilla thing. So I don't know. I've fermented with 100% Tropics just to give people that juicy experience. We didn't tell the customers that these beers were fermented with Chico and these beers were fermented with Tropics. We were just giving them two different experiences. So if I wanted a beer that was very hop dominated, then I would do the Chico ferment. And if I wanted a beer that just like was over the top in character, I would use Tropics. We've fermented with 100% pure Tropics pitch. That was always, like I said before, it was preferred by customers there.
Sure. Now, Nick, I know you guys have, some thoughts around some of this kind of, what has somewhat become a old wives' tale or just some assumed knowledge around approaches to mash hopping. Obviously, Gene mentioned doing it earlier because certainly was put out there that this was a great way of doing it. But you guys have done some studies on this and found the results are maybe a little bit different than people expect from that.
Yeah, what we found is that it doesn't really matter when you add hops. I like what Gene just said, though. It's interesting that you're adding the hops in the mash to decrease bitterness. You're trying to decrease the BU pickup that you might pick up in the whirlpool, for instance. So that seems like a fair reason to add hops into the mash. But if the reason that you're adding hops into the mash is just to extract thiol precursors, there are much better ways to do that. So in terms of getting more precursor into your beer, and the easiest one and the cheapest one actually is just to add Tropics Boost. And I'm not just trying to be a salesperson here, but it literally is just pure 3MH precursor dissolved in ethanol and water. So the more you add, the more you turn it up. When you're adding hops, you're getting all sorts of other things that you might not want. So there are polyphenols in there, for instance. If you're adding Citra into the mash, sure, that's fine, but you're going to lose most of what makes Citra when you add it into the mash by the time it's gone through the boil, the whirlpool, etc. So you're just kind of throwing money away at that point. So I think it's fine if you're doing that, but there's just more efficient ways.
Clear it up for me. Tropics Boost. I'm trying to keep track of these things. I hear Tropics, now I hear Tropics Boost.
Yeah.
Explain the difference and what those are to me.
Yeah, sure. Tropics London is a yeast strain. And like Tim was saying, it's based on a London ale yeast. And all we've done is we've inserted one additional gene that allows it to unlock these thiols from different ingredients like barley, for instance. Tropics Boost is a liquid that you add at the time that you pitch the yeast. And it's just pure precursor. So it really is a dimmer switch for turning up thiols. I should mention, so if you ferment with 100% Tropics, that will give you one flavor profile. You can turn it down by co-pitching. And now that so we have a product called Dry Tropics London. It's just dry yeast. It's dry Tropics. You can co-pitch it very easily. Dry yeast makes it easy to co-pitch and have consistent results every single time. So the less Tropics you add, the less thiol that will be produced. So that's turning it down. If you want to turn it up, you just add Tropics Boost. And the more that you add, the more that you'll turn it up almost linearly. So this is a concept that was originally coined, I believe, in a craft beer and brewing article, maybe a couple years back, but we've kind of, people forgot about it. So we just had to bring it back to light again. It's called the thiol dial. And so the thiol dial, the concept is co-pitch to turn it down, add Tropics Boost to turn it up. And I just want to mention a funny piece of history is that, so Tim over at Cellar Maker, when he was there, is just across the bay from us. So we started out in Berkeley, then we had a location in Oakland, and Tim would come over to our facility quite frequently and would give us feedback. So we have 18 5-gallon fermenters that are each individually temperature controlled, a 1-barrel brew house. Originally, our 1-barrel brew house, by the way, was Ghost Town's original brew house that we bought from them. And so we still to this day brew 6 beers every single week. We do controlled experiments where we'll knock out 1 barrel into 6 fermenters, and typically 1 fermenter is a control. So it might be an unedited yeast strain, and then the other 5 fermenters are engineered strains, or we might do 6 different fermenters of all the same yeast with different hopping regimens. But in this way, we can do very controlled experiments. Anyways, Tim used to come over, and he did this for many years, and would give us feedback on all of our strains. So when we first launched our diacetyl-free yeast, Fresh Chico, many years ago, this was actually in large part because of Tim's feedback. And he told us how much of an issue hop creep was in diacetyl, and how diacetyl, even if it's hanging out right below flavor threshold, is still dulling the perception of hops. And he wanted to be able to have hop expression just be a little bit cleaner. Tim's always trying to get everything to be a little bit cleaner. He's always thinking about esters and where they're, what profile they're bringing to beer and diacetyl, etc. So when we developed Tropics and Tropics Boost, that was alongside Tim providing guidance. So we actually had other varieties of Tropics Boost originally, including one that produced more Form P, and we found it to be polarizing. But with Tim's guidance, we developed the current version that we have. And Tim, alongside Corey at Moxa and Derek at the time, they were the first to ever brew with Tropics Boost. And what was the name of the beer, Tim? Can't remember.
Suzanne Simcoe's Thiol Master.
It was a very
Just
cool beer.
A perfectly dumb cellar maker name, as we are good at.
But I probably lost you at this point, Jamie. But the way that we started here was talking about mash hopping and is it the best way of doing it? The answer is you don't need to mash hop. You can if you want to. If you do mash hop, I highly recommend only using hops that you want in an IPA. Please, no saws, no noble hops. Those aren't going to bring anything into a beer that you actually want, especially if you're going for tropical flavors. But if you just care about thiol precursors and loading up your beer with those, there are better ways of doing that, primarily with Tropics Boost.
Sure. Gene and Nick, have you guys done any yeast blending to try to, dial in some specific profiles here?
I have not.
We haven't yet, but it's funny that we're talking about this. Is we're actually I just ordered yeast today to do this little experiment where we're going to brew a ordinary bitter with just fresh London, and then a week later we're going to harvest off of that and co-pitch one brick on a 10-barrel batch of London Tropics into a hazy IPA, and then the week after that we're going to harvest that yeast and then repitch into a hazy double IPA with the Tropics Boost to see how that does. It sounds like it works pretty well, but that'll be our first time trying that at ISM.
Nice. Nick Walker, for you, as you're thinking about how to kind of, tuck in and create a little bit of thiol character that kind of gives it an edge. And when I say this, one of the things that I really love about this, expression, the fruit flavor is there, but I find that like every kind of fruit flavor, if they can add a structure without bitterness per se, or even with a perceived bitterness that feels like, say, the fruit pith rather than like something herbal or, something more stereotypically of quote unquote hop bitterness, and so using those kind of compounds to help create some of that structure to the beer without it necessarily being perceived as bitterness, having it be more a little fruit pithy and having that give it a structure, I think helps some people who may not consider themselves fans of bitter beer or big IPA fans, helps them kind of connect without losing the structure that you need to have a beer be successful and drinkable and not just be cloying and sweet and fruit juice. For you guys, Nick, how do you think about using some of that kind of character and tucking in so that these beers stay accessible, but also stay in the zone of fruit flavors that people expect from them?
I think back to what you're talking about is a good profile, a good base recipe might have more bitterness, less bitterness, and we play around with that bitterness pretty heavily with our IPAs. So we have our baseline IPA that has a pretty strong bitterness component for what I would say normal in our industry. I think our customer base really liked that, but as we dial in more ABV, as we dial in more hops than the dry hop, we will start cutting that back. It's a little counterintuitive, but I think people expect like a single IPA to have a little bit of that just easy drinkable bitterness profile, and then you dial up an IPA and people want they expect that heaviness, they expect the resins, they expect all these profiles that we're talking about with the thiols to really resonate out and jump out at you. And I think that is something that really helps the balance and helps people get what they expect out of the beer.
So you crank it up then in double IPA territory when you're up there, and it can be loud and sweet, but also maybe not the same kind of level of the bitterness doesn't rise incrementally along with some of the other intensity of flavor?
Correct. Yeah, proportionally, we do not treat it like the same beer. We start dialing that back. Again, I think people just want what they expect, which is a big hop hit at that point, and the bitterness can be hard to cut through, and it just adds some not haze and cloudiness to the profile of what people are trying to drink.
Gene, as you think about those, those kind of, pithy kind of characters that can also, fit in this kind of spectrum, how does that work into the way that you envision, balance bitterness and the quality of bitterness in, say, a West Coast IPA?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think for us, the biggest thing we're looking for is just like a clean, tight, quickly dissipating bitterness, where we're trying to use lower coagulone hops, where it just hits real quick and then flashes off the palate. A little bit of lingering, kind of depending on the beer, but yeah, kind of similar to what Nick was talking about. Like, we definitely treat each beer differently depending on what exact combination of hops in the dry hop, or what kind of flavors we're shooting for with the recipe. So
sure. Tim, whether it was your cellar maker brewing days or even your current experimental brewing days now, how have you started thinking about ways to use thiols and thiol expression as a structuring element within these, and not only a fruit flavor element? It's important as that, but it also some of these notes can add that nice structure.
Yeah, recently as a Berkeley employee, I've been able to do several collabs with great hazy IPA brewers, and we've really been exploring how thiols, how you can reduce them via different methods, but like use them as a tool to uplift and create a more exaggerated hop character in general. So, for example, just did a double IPA collaboration with Humble Sea, where we'd co-pitched 50% fresh London, which is our low diacetyl London strain, and then 50% dry tropics. And smelling that beer, I wouldn't call out, like, I know that character, that 3MH character very well. I've used the yeast for a long time. So trying that beer, I wouldn't be like, oh, this is a 3MH bomb, tropics bomb. But what it was just like all the other hops in there. I think we used Dulcita Incognito. There was some Nelson, some Eldorado. Those hops were just like amplified by the presence of the 3MH. And it was just like such a juicy, amazing beer. And another collab we did was with Outer Range, where we did 100% tropics. But we used hops that are pre-3MH, like forward in general. So there was some Simcoe, but there was a ton of Nelson Cryo. And that beer just like came off as incredibly dank and vibrant. And actually the coolest part of that is we got a couple of cases from them, and the cans have been sitting in our cold box. And we're trying the beer periodically. And we cracked one a couple of weeks ago, and now this beer now is like 4 months old. I have drank enough beer in my life where like hoppy beers at 4 months old aren't usually that great. But what's cool about thiols is, anecdotally, they are maybe antioxidative. And there's some literature on that. One thing we tell people not to do is add copper into their beer. It's very in vogue to put copper into your beer to like reduce sulfur in lagers. But some people just end up doing it for every beer. Well, thiols and copper don't mix. It's not a good technique to use with anything you want to be thiol forward. And so because this maybe antioxidative quality, that beer tasted still amazing at 4 months. So much so that our salesperson, Anthony Lopez, brought it down to Texas and poured it at a convention down there. And I was like, whoa, dude, that beer is 4 months old. I don't think you should do that. And then when we tried it, we're like, oh, this still fucks. This is great. So that's kind of interesting. So that's kind of what I've been trying to think about lately is like how, as Nick said, how to use this thiol dial to as a tool, not only to present 3MH in your beer, but also as maybe a way to keep a beer's longevity and extend that.
Sure. No, I mean, it makes some sense there, right? They're sulfur compounds, and that we all know that there is a preservative element to that in general. So
Exactly. Yeah.
Just want to highlight what Tim just said about using low levels of thiols by co-pitching, for instance, to amplify hop notes. If you think about it, pineapple, mango, grapefruit, etc., all of those fruits have thiols in them. They don't taste like a big thiol bomb, for instance, but without those thiols, those fruits wouldn't punch as hard as they do. So even though you don't eat a pineapple, and at least for me, I'm not thinking about 3MH, but I know that it's there and it's amplifying those juicy, fruity notes. So, and a lot of cannabis has different thiols. There's all sorts of ways that there's synergies with different flavor compounds, and in this case, thiols, where that can certainly be the case. So, like Tim's saying, if you just want to boost up your hop aromas a little bit more, having a low level of thiols in there can help you do that, even if it's not making it taste like a thiol heavy, putting thiols on the forefront of the palate, for instance.
There are bad thiols out there too, right? Like mercaptans are thiols. And at low levels, mercaptans can maybe increase the intensity of a beer. But unfortunately to me, it seems like there's a trend of like pushing mercaptan in your beer like a little higher than I like. Like West Coast IPA these days, there's a lot of producers, like, highly respected producers that I just get a lot of beers from them that have that kind of grungy sewer drain run fruit thing. And I know why they do it. It's like the beer is an intense presentation of hops. But for my palate, I think that we've kind of gone too far, and I'd like to see us step that back. And so, yeah, just my 2 cents on that. And it's like, what is cool about 3MH and yeast-derived 3MH is that from our lab, we put a lot of work into making it a very targeted protein, and that protein is like not giving you the mercaptans, it's not giving you these other sulfurous aromas, it's just honed in on 3MH, and I think that is like a great tool to give you intensity, but not the wrong intensity.
Sure. We all, we talk on the podcast and the magazine quite frequently about, those hops that in low levels help bring out characters in other hops. It's a bit like a chef using salt, right? You don't want it to taste salty. If it tastes salty, then you probably haven't done it right, but the right amount of salt along with the right intensity of other flavors can help elevate and pull out all of the rest of those things within that dish. And it's the same kind of thing here. If it just tastes like overwhelming thiols, then, it's not necessarily as interesting or as powerful or as successful as using those thiols to help highlight and pinpoint and bring forward, some of the other fruit character that, the people really love. Gene, for you guys with New Zealand style IPA, how do you think about using, creating these thiols and this expression, making specific hop selections and then building a process that helps, pull all of those thiols together with the right kind of expression? We often talk about New Zealand IPA only in the sense of New Zealand hops, but I mean, maybe it's the industry's dirtiest little secret. There are a number of beers that win in the New Zealand IPA category that have some or sometimes no New Zealand hops in them, because those thiols can be achieved, and that similar profile can be achieved using hops, from the Pacific Northwest. It's just how you use them and, the process behind it. But for you guys, how do you think about building some hop blends in a way that works with your fermentation profile to kind of, ultimately create interesting and compelling, kind of thiol expression across a few different beers?
Yeah, sure. So, we have, for being such a small brewery, we have fairly extensive New Zealand hop contracts. And so the beer that we just got gold at JBF for and the Reader's Choice award, that is very heavy on Superdelic, which is one of the newer ones coming out of New Zealand, which I've really dug. From the first time we selected it, just rubbing even like 3 different cores of the same hop, coming from Rawaka, Nelson, Nectaron. The Superdelic cores like really stood out. They honestly kind of just blew every other varietal off the table. So that was like immediate first impression there. But then, of course, when we get the pelletized, first box and use it, it's not quite as intense. But that's not to say that it's not, contributing in a pretty big way. So, but anyway, yeah, that beer is quite a bit of Superdelic. We do sort of accent it with Crush or HPC 586. And then there is a little bit of Mosaic in there too. So it's still primarily, Superdelic New Zealand hops, but we kind of use that Mosaic and Crush to kind of anchor, and kind of bring together the beer. So you have a little bit of, resin, but then also the Crush kind of brings out the more fruity, almost candy-like notes in that beer. And then the one other thing we do, which not necessarily thiolized yeast-wise, but with that beer, going back to the malt, we will use a slightly, I don't know for sure if it's a higher, thiol precursor malt, but we found that when we use Great Western Pure Idaho Pills in that beer as the base, it does seem to kick off a little more of a like fruity, thiol-y dry character than a super neutral Pilsner base. So yeah, that one has been very fun.
Sure, Nick, as you're, with your beers that you're designing in using these thiol unlocking yeasts for, are there specific hops that you find yourself, or, specific ways that you're using specific hops that fit into the process to ultimately produce the kind of refined flavor that you're looking for?
Yeah. My dad was the olfactory researcher, and what he always taught me was 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2 with taste and smells. And so I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here is thiols are a great tool, and we can dial it up, dial it down, depending on what we want to do. You take the hops that you love, hops that you don't love, play around with them, but ultimately what you're trying to do is create a profile that what you're shooting for, but you don't always know where to get that. And so I think that's where I love just playing around with new hops and trying to figure out what does the top do. It's like what Gene was talking about with the Superdelic of like, it didn't quite hit as hard, but it really added a lot to that beer. And how do you play around with other hops to prop it up and bolster it? I'm probably getting a lot of shit for this. So I like Sabro, like a 10% level, not more than 10%. But I think Sabro does a really good job of bolstering some of these other hops and really making them sing. And so I think that's kind of what we try to do is what helps these things push out forward. And I'm not as eloquent as Tim, but a lot of what we're doing here is playing around and have these hops really jump forward with the different tools at our belt.
Man, this is like the second time in a few weeks that I've heard a brewer admit to using Sabro in small sub-threshold kinds of ways in order to help, bring out characters of their hops. Or, in terms of, driving some of the main thiol expression, are there specific hops that you use in concert with this yeast that you think, give you really great results and that pull out the specific fruit flavors that you're looking for?
I honestly don't know. I mean, we use so much Citra and then play around with other hops as well. We'll leave it out. I can't tell you a straight answer on that.
That's fair. How about you, Tim? Are there some specific hops that you find in concert with these thiol unlocking yeast that you all make that offer some really, either compelling or interesting or unusual kinds of characters? And I say unusual because, you got a lot of brewers making lots of beer out there, but we all don't want to make the same beer. We want to, find those things that add some specific character and then make it interesting. So, are there other hops that work really well in this context?
I don't know if I could call out a specific hop that like creates some type of experience that's, not expected. Like Citra's going to taste like Citra, Nelson's going to taste like Nelson. But what I would say to brewers who want to kind of get into this thiol game a little bit is like, take a recipe that you've always made, that you know well, start there, don't change anything but the yeast, and then just see how the yeast transforms that beer in a way that you will definitely instantly recognize. It's going to be obvious. And then, figure out, okay, do I like the hop profile along here? Do I want to change that up? Do I want to dial up the thiols? Do I want to bring them down? There's that thiol dial that Nick talks about. Like, start simple and just kind of pave your own path here. For us, like at Cellar Maker, we would just use the hits, honestly. Like it's not so much about like trying to coax new things out of the hops. It's about going up the hop selection, finding the badass hops, and then creating amazing beers with those. So I don't think the yeast is like completely teasing out new things. It just kind of will add an underlying level of intensity. And like you said, Jamie, like sometimes it can be a little bit of that salt that just makes things pop a little bit more.
Gene and Nick, the other piece of this is is efficiency. If you make really heavily saturated hoppy beers and you do that, by just cranking up the load of pellets in the dry hop and or in the whirlpool, like you're putting a lot of material in this liquid that's going to absorb that liquid, and it's going to destroy your yields from these. And, and every brewer understands that, right? You want the intensity, but if you try to increase more and more intensity that way, just by, throwing 10 pounds per barrel of hops, whether, through the whirlpool and dry hop, like you're just going to have so little beer left at the end of it. And, you're also going to hit a saturation level where it's just hard to even get some of that hop character out. So you lose liquid and you have a harder, you just get diminishing returns on there. How has using yeast that unlocks thiols helped augment those kinds of hop loads to get more of this expression, but also doing it in an efficient way that's maybe, reducing some of your loss? Have you had some experience around that?
I think so, yeah. So having only used London Tropics now twice at ISM, but having had used Fresh London several times before that, I was able to kind of not side by side, beer to beer per se, but just having the recent memory of what those beers were tasting like before trying the Tropics. Even just harvesting yeast and like not sticking my nose in the brink or whatnot, but you could smell it from across the brewery, and I was like, did we already dry hop this beer? Was my immediate reaction. And it wasn't like I considered not dry hopping it at all, but I did think about it for a second. So yeah, no, I think it's the kind of thing where you could, I'm not going to say you should cut your dry hop in half right away, but it is the kind of thing where perhaps you don't need to do whatever, if you're starting at like 6 pounds per barrel or even like 4 pounds per barrel, maybe dial back a pound per barrel and see if you're hitting that same intensity. That is something that we were able to achieve, I think we were around 3.5 to 4 pounds per barrel on hazy single IPA, and we're able to get it down to 3. Still have that same intensity, without any type of compromise in the tropical punch of it.
Nick, for you guys, does efficiency enter into this in some way? And, this is not, like, there are different modes. There are those brewers that are simply looking for the most expression in their competition batch to, like, stand up in this kind of environment, or, to drive those highest on tap scores, but also, this is equally valuable potentially in this kind of efficiency production minded brewery as well.
Yeah, we've just got that from day one. We added the same amount of hops we would for our normal IPAs. I totally agree with Eugene that it pops before we dry hop it. I've had another brewer bring me a sample, and I'm like, this before or after that first initial small dry hop. But no, we haven't cut down our amount of hop usage because of it. For me, it doesn't move the needle all that much. 5% change on just the hop doesn't really make it that much more efficient for my brewery. Now, yield, it would definitely help, but I don't know. It seems like something that we're chasing that I don't want to chase.
That's totally fair. For you guys, Tim, have you found that there are, some ways to find some efficiencies, using this?
Absolutely. Cellar Maker didn't back down on the hops. Kind of like Nick, we dry hop still at 4 pounds per barrel, more sometimes. But I know of customers of Berkeley Yeast who do use it for that reason. The one thing I would advise, though, is if you're going to use, thiol producing yeast as a way of improving efficiency and lowering COGS, if you're making hazy IPA, a lot of the haze comes from hops. And so if you're going to back down on the hops a little bit, you might want to consider something that will improve haze, or using a hop that we know is very haze positive, like New Zealand hops, right? Because I ordered a hazy IPA at a customer knowing that it was tropics, and it wasn't a super hazy beer. I like my hazy to be pretty milky and turbid. So that might just been a regional thing because it was on the East Coast or Southeast. But yeah, just think about that before changing anything. And you mentioned competitions. I think one other anecdote I've been hearing is that if you're submitting hazy IPAs made with thiol producing yeasts, that some judges are getting kind of hip to that and like honing in on that character. And so I would say 100% use a thiol producing yeast for a competition beer, but use that thiol dial concept to just bring it down a little bit, where it's going to bolster the hops and just have this thing exude juiciness. It's kind of ironic that like beers are going to be pushed off a table for being too juicy from a yeast character. I think that's pretty hilarious. But if that's honestly the case, I still think you're going to make an award-winning beer by using tropics, but just, modulate by co-pitch. We mentioned different raw materials, different grains have different levels of precursors. So kind of figure out where your balance of two-row and wheat, like wheat is a lower precursor amount than two-row. We're actually doing some internal research right now at Berkeley. Hopefully it's be some information we can share with folks to just further understand how to dial up or down these styles.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to stay tuned for some more knowledge from brewers through this award cycle, and see how things shake out in all of the judging this year. I'm curious about it. We're in the midst of we are just getting submissions for our annual IPA issue, and I have been tasting through lots and lots of IPAs over the past week. And I think what you said is interesting when you said earlier. I can now pick out that pretty, signature London Ale 3 kind of character and the kind of, peachiness that might deliver. And it's interesting when I get a hazy IPA that doesn't have that, but that pulls out some different kinds of fruit flavors. And, and it becomes the name of the game, right? Finding a way to stand out amidst a competitive flight and make something interesting that becomes memorable. And but also, I think that key piece is finding that kind of definition, even in these sweet, fruity, and kind of intense beer flavors. And so finding the way to pull that together, I find increasingly. And I see this in some of the judging and the way that some of the competition judging is going. The big competitions are absolutely leaning towards light, refined, and well-defined. And I think that some of this spot little bits of thiol character help drive exactly that kind of character in a way that becomes very complementary to some of these. And that heavy and sweet doesn't win awards, but also from a consumer standpoint, is harder to drink. And, you as brewers want people to order a few of these and not just one, because that, again, that's what makes this whole thing viable. Anyway, off on a tangent here. Nick, as we bring it home on thiols, are there any subjects that we want to touch on before we wrap this up? Anything that, any additional points that you want to make to kind of bring this to a close and tie it up with a bow?
I would say that if you've tried brewing with a thiol yeast strain in the past and didn't think you had, didn't like the result, I'd give it another shot. Reach out to us. You can hit Tim up, for instance. He can help you out with recipe design. I think the recommendation that he had about starting with a beer that you're already really familiar with, just swapping in the yeast and seeing how it goes, that's a great way to start, and then dial it up or down from there. But I just say, I'd give it another shot. Make sure you're not throwing the whole kitchen sink at it. So don't mash hop and throw 8 pounds per barrel of Nelson on top of it and a bunch of, whatever else there. Just brew the beer as you normally do and just see what it does. So that'd be number one. And then, just stay tuned. We are doing more research on malts, different malts and precursor load. And we've already seen that even within two-row and Pilsner, these lower kiln malts that typically have a lot of precursors, there is variation between different suppliers. There's variation in terms of how long the malt has been stored and how it's been produced as well. So we've been seeing some differences. For instance, when we do, if we ever autoclave, which is a fancy word for pressure cooking, sometimes we do that in order to prepare sterile media in-house. And we've been noticing that has an influence on precursor load. So there are a lot of different ways that you can influence the precursors, the precursor load, which will then have a effect on the final concentration of these thiols in your finished beer. And again, just to hit one last time, there are better ways than mash hopping than to load up with precursors. And I'll just leave you with that.
Tell me how you really feel about mash hopping, Nick. Now, if people want to learn more about Berkeley Yeast and the line of products that you sell, the yeasts in this Tropics family, the products, I should say, Yeast and Tropics Boost, where should they go to learn more?
We have a new article on our website called All About Thiols. You can find it pretty easily from the homepage. We do a deep dive into thiols there. You can find out about all of our products on our website as well. You can also order online. If you're just trying to get started and want to do it affordably, I'd highly recommend starting off with the dry version of Tropics. It's $150 for a 500 gram brick, and then there are discounts on top of that. So if you buy more than that, you'll see some discounts. And that's just a really easy way to get started. And again, you can co-pitch it with your house strain to dial it down. So it's just a great way to use yeast as an ingredient for modulating flavor, not just for something that consumes sugar and makes beer.
And I'll say it for you because it's berkeleyyeast.com, the website that you meant to steer people towards. What were you going to say, Tim?
I just wanted to add on top of that, a lot of this discussion's been around hazy IPA, but the yeast works really well in many styles. You could do like a light 4.5% blonde ale that's just got that really clean, vibrant passion fruit expression. What I used to do at Cellar Maker, I would make mixed culture beers, barrel-aged mixed culture beers, where I'd fill a barrel with about 2/3 of our kind of like house mixed culture saison, and then top it with 1/3 of a Tropics fermented hazy IPA. And like 6 months later, that is just an incredibly magical beer, super juicy, super vibrant. A lot of esters and probably the thiols blow off over that time. It's just the nature of mixed culture beer aged in barrel. But like, I think the thiols did hang on a little bit and just like protect the beer. And so those beers were always just like really magical, just like absolutely beautiful. And they were some of my favorite beers we ever made with that base blend.
That's awesome. Tim, if people want to reach out to you directly for some thoughts on how to use these, is there a way they can reach you?
Yep. My email is tim@berkeleyyeast.com.
Easy enough. Well, Nick, Gene, Nick, Tim, I think we got all the Nicks covered there. It's been great talking to you all about adjusting the thiol dial in your hoppy beers. Really appreciate Berkeley Yeast for supporting this special episode and this focus. I hope brewers are taking away some pragmatic ways to adjust thiol expression in their own beers. And it's been a lot of fun talking with all of you all. Cheers.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media @craftbeerbrew.